Good afternoon. In this video, I want to deal with the issue of suffering, particularly with the issue of Christian suffering. Why do Christians suffer? I'll be reading from, again, the Grace Family Journal, and you can get this online. It's from a Ministry of Grace Gospel Press of the Duluth Bible Church, and you can get the actual copy, or you can go online and see their copies online. But this is an excerpt from a book written by an individual who has terminal illness. The editor's note: this article is taken from Chapter 6, Why Me, of Dr. Bruce Baker's book, For Thou Art With Me, A Biblical Help for the Terminally Ill and Those Who Love Them. This very personal, practical, and scriptural book is recommended for anyone dealing with suffering. Baker begins Chapter 1 by writing: the individual has, Dr. Baker has ALS, terrible disease. And so he writes about that and the fact that he's been given essentially a death sentence, and that's the purpose of the book, to talk about the issue of dealing with terminal illness and how do you deal with that, how a Christian deals with it, and the family members. But in reality, we all have a terminal illness. It's called sin. We're all going to die. You realize that, don't you? Except for rapture. Other than the rapture generation, there's one generation that's going to get out of it. And it could be us. Could be the rapture's imminent. It could be happening tomorrow. This man could get out of it. He could be raptured out. In fact, his ALS, they say he's living longer than the doctors expected. But by and large, every generation is terminal. And that's the reality of the sin that plagues us. We have a virus. We're talking about the virus going around, and everyone's panicking and getting disturbed by it. We're born with the virus. We're born with the virus that kills us. So it's killing us as soon as we're born. And that's the reality of how fragile our life is. And it can happen any time. It can be, infants. It could, infants die and old men die. So we tend not to think about death. But that's why that's why funerals are more reality than the house of rejoicing. Something like Ecclesiastes. It's better to go to a funeral than just go to the house of rejoicing. Why? The funeral is reality. The funeral is to bring home the reality. None of us escape death. And one issue of suffering is that we see loved ones dying. If you live long enough, you're all going to lose loved ones. You're going to lose parents. You're going to lose brothers, sisters, wives, husbands, and eventually you yourself are going to die. So this is the reality, and this is a reality that Satan tries to veil. One of the great deceptions of Satan is that it's trying to hide the reality of death. It's never going to happen to you. Somehow, it's trying to keep it out of your mind. It's like eat and drink and make merry, and forget about tomorrow. But tomorrow's coming. So suffering is a very real issue, and death is one of those issues, and funerals is the reality of a graveyard. The graveyard is where we're all going to end up sooner or later, barring the rapture. And of course, the difference between a Christian and unbeliever is because we have hope. We know we're not staying there. Our bodies are coming out. So he writes here: God in His goodness has provided specific answers to the question, why do Christians suffer? Some of these answers aren't directly applicable to the problem of terminal illness, such as persecution from a non-believing world, see 2 Timothy 3:12, 13, John 15, 18 to 21, so they aren't discussed here. Others, however, are directly applicable and are discussed in this book. Not all these reasons will apply to your specific situation, but at least one will, and most likely more than one. And then he quotes here Psalm 119:67. Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I obey your word. Sometimes we suffer as part of the call of God. Now, he's got this to the unbelievers. Actually, Job 5:7 is more applicable to the unbeliever. That when Job was talking about the suffering, and Job was supposed to be the first book written in terms of time, and as considered the oldest book, and it deals with the issue of suffering. Yet man is born unto trouble as the sparks fly upward. The idea is that what Satan's goal is try to make this world into a millennium, into perfection that God will do in the millennium kingdom. And there would still be death in the millennium kingdom, but lives would be greatly extended, and death really takes a holiday. There are still aspects of death, but very, very few, and life is much longer, perfect environment. Satan can't duplicate all that. Every time he tries to get everything set up, he starts falling apart on him because he can't deal with sin. Sin just corrupts everything, and so he can't control. He's the God of this world, but he can't control his own world, and that's what frustrates him. Many times the call of God at the very beginning of our Christian life involves suffering and affliction. Okay, so the unbelievers. This is why God will often bring in crisis to get the unbelievers. That's the tribulation, the issue of tribulation in the after the rapture. You have wars, you have rumors of wars, you have things all going on. These are to get people's attention to the reality of eternity, and because most people aren't going to think about eternity. Most people are going to be involved in their daily life and not grasp the fact that what's next? After you die, then what? And he goes on to about Acts 16, the Philippian jailer in fear for his life because he thought the prisoners had escaped, was about to kill himself when Paul shouted out, "We are all here," and then led him to Christ. In John 4, a nobleman whose son was sick was terrified that his son might die, so the man came to see Jesus and trusted in him. There was a woman with a bleeding disease in Luke 8 who came to Christ as a result of her illness. In Matthew 15, there was a woman of Canaan whose daughter was demon-possessed, who came to Jesus because of her fear for her daughter. The list goes on and on. I have no doubt that many reading these words could testify that it was trouble and trial that God used to break their will, and bring them to the Savior. That work continues even today. It could be that your illness is designed for your ultimate good. That is, that you may trust in Jesus Christ and his finished work on the cross and his resurrection from the dead so that you might be saved. If this is the case, though this physical suffering is troublesome, the eternal benefit the eternal benefit you will receive from it is so far beyond the cost as to not be compared. Remember the blind man, John chapter 9, 40 years blind. And people say, what sin did his parents, did he commit, or the sin his parents commit, that blindness? So he wasn't blind for that. Anything he did is for the glory of God, to show that Christ was God, and he could open up man's eyes. And he got saved because of that. He got saved. And many other people got saved because they saw his eyes being opened up. So it's the reality of suffering in this world that often brings people to Jesus Christ. They come to an end. They come to the end of their abilities. They come to the end. It's come to a point where he says they can't do anything anymore. They're helpless. I just finished reading a book on the U.S. infantry in World War II, it's called The Deadly Brotherhood. And one of the common attributes, the things that they talk about, is they all started praying. And they were faced with combat, and the individual, 85% of people interviewed said they prayed. They said they started praying. Now, I'm not saying all of them were saved because they prayed, but the fact was that it brought the reality to how helpless, because how arbitrary combat is. You don't know who's going to get it next. And yeah, in the infantry in World War II, there was no end. They didn't have rotation like they do, later had put in Vietnam and later wars, like now we got Afghanistan, we rotated 20 times back there. But these guys were there, and they were there years. And the only way you got out was either you got killed, or you got a severe wound, or you got captured, or you endured to the end. You endured to the end. Physically, you survived physically. So you think about that, 3-4 years, these guys, and they're living day to day under that pressure of knowing they could die any moment. And one of their ways to deal with that was prayer. And they would pray, get me through this day. The Chosen Reservoir campaign with the Marines, 1st Division, where they were surrounded by the Chinese, and that was very common. They would pray, just get us, they were fighting below zero weather and fierce combat. And you hear the Marines just praying, give me this day. When you're in that type of situation, you're living a moment to moment, day by day. That's one thing God will get your attention on. Are you living day to day? What are you doing today? Yesterday's gone. You don't have tomorrow. And that's the reality of suffering. Suffering brings you into the face of you have no control of many things. The main thing, you think you have control of things, but you really don't. You really have no control, or you think you have control. we always like to think we're under control. I got this under control. And then something happens, and man, I got no control of anything. This happens, that happens. I've seen guys, getting the stock market's going down, and people are saying, they were happy when it was going up. And now they're getting their phone keys wiped out and everything. It's a panic, panic. Of course, the best time to buy is during a panic. There's one book, someone wrote a book called Blood in the Streets. You don't buy when the stocks are going up, you buy when they're going down. But the fact is that I went, the virus, and it's just worst day, in the stock market. But the fact is, you see people now really, seeing the negative parts of the stock market. So now he's positive. You can't always go up forever. But the fact is, you're out of control. Man doesn't have control of certain things. We think we do. We want to think we have control. We want to think we're the masters of our fate, and we are not. We are not. There are things way out of our control. I mean, the things that could happen to you, and you read about it all the time. It's just, things that happen, just, where'd that come from, we take for granted, you get in the car, take for granted you're going to get from point A to point B. You just take it for granted. There's no guarantee. There's no guarantee someone's not going to run a stop sign or run a red light. No guarantees at all. Now, we can't live our lives based on that fear or those apprehensions, but that's the reality of it. And that's just to show you, it's all in God's hands. And you live one day at a time. You get one day at a time. That's all you get. Sometimes we suffer as the consequences of our actions. Now, this is the issue of eternal security and the issue of suffering in time. And you deal with people with eternal security, attack eternal security. They always want to say, like, particularly from the Armenian point of view, well, that's not enough suffering. So if you're sinning, they have to take the salvation away from you, or put you in outer darkness. We've got to make you suffer more. Even though Christ paid for those sins. Suffering in time as a purpose is that to get you right with God. And there are consequences, cause and effect, just like the unbeliever. Just like the unbeliever. The Christian is not suspended from cause and effect in the real world. If you commit a crime, you're going to be punished for that crime. You can't, God will come in and rescue me because I did this. I'm a Christian. You're going to jail. You're going to jail. More than likely. But if you're thinking, well, I'm a Christian, I can get away with this. No. cause and effect for the unbeliever, and those same cause and effects exist for the believer. And on top of the believer, as opposed to the unbeliever, is God's discipline added to that. So you get double. You get the issue of cause and effect, plus you get God's discipline for disobeying God in a particular area. So he quotes Galatians 6, 7, and 8. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. Now I don't know if these are all King James readings here. We read it from the King James. Galatians 6, 7, 8. Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. But he that soweth to the Spirit, and that's the Holy Spirit there, shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. So, and that's because from rewards there. So the reality is you can't break God's natural laws and expect to get away with it, and somehow live above those laws. To understand these verses in the original context, we must recognize that Paul is speaking to believers. It is to members of the church that he gives this instruction. Please notice that Paul begins with a warning. Do not be deceived. Again, that's a great enemy. Do not be deceived. This shows that it's all too easy to be deceived in this area. It shows that all of us are vulnerable to the notion that our actions don't have consequences. Paul tells us not to be deceived into believing this lie. He then moves into laws of sowing and reaping. The laws of sowing and reaping are these: you harvest what you plant. You harvest more than you plant. The harvest is certain, even if it is delayed. Now, of course, the prosperity people misuse this. The harvest you had might not be physical. Yeah, it might not be good health. It might not be, a beautiful house. It might not be, money in the bank. It could be all spiritual. In the Old Testament, it's physical. And that's why you see in Proverbs, a lot of these things are dealing with physical blessings. But here you're talking about the Christian who can get spiritual blessings when he's sowing. And then what he's reaping is spiritual blessings. So the prosperity people say, well, if you're suffering, you shouldn't be. You should have, all this money in the bank. You should have, 3 cars, this, blah, 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 That's not what this verse is talking about. For a Christian, he gets spiritual blessings. So often you can see a Christian who doesn't have hardly anything. And you have great spiritual blessings. He can have contentment, peace, and knowing, the rewards he's going to have in heaven. Let's see. The harvest certain. I may wander up, for example, if I plant beans in the field, I may wander up and down the side rows praying diligently for a good corn crop. But when it comes time to harvest, I'm going to get beans. Not only am I going to get beans, I'm going to get way more beans than I planted. Finally, even though there was a time delay between when I planted it and when I harvest, the harvest will eventually come. At some point in the future, sooner or later, I'm going to harvest beans. In the same way, the laws of sowing and reaping apply to our lives as well. At this point, I want to stress that this law has nothing to do with our forgiveness before God. Our forgiveness before God is totally and solely dependent upon our belief in Jesus Christ and what he did on the cross. The things that we do or don't do are immaterial to the question of our salvation. That being said, whether you're a believer or an unbeliever, the laws of sowing and reaping apply to you. Laws of cause and effect. You can't just ignore them. The reason they apply to you is because of their purpose. God has instituted these laws so that he will not be mocked. If we sow to the flesh, from the flesh we reap destruction. So God has set up the laws that even unbelievers can be blessed. These laws will bless unbelievers as well as believers. Now, the issue in eternity, these people aren't going to be in heaven. But they can be blessed on earth if they follow God's laws here on earth. In practical terms, what does this mean? Well, if I get drunk, steal a car, get in an accident, lose a leg, I can most certainly confess my sin before God and be forgiven and restored to fellowship. This is undoubtedly true, but it's also true that my leg won't grow back, and most likely I'm going to jail. In the same way, if I smoked a pack for a day for the last 40 years, I shouldn't be surprised by now of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It's all a matter of sowing and reaping. You can't suspend certain things. The reality. And just one of the things that the world rejects today is reality. This brings home reality. There's an article about emotionalism. And you see like the Bernie Sanders one, the socialist one. They're dealing with delusion. Free everything. The Christian deals with reality. What is. So what we see guys like Bernie Sanders running and these other guys out there, well, we're just going to give you free this, free that, free that, free that. It's not reality. Christians supposed to deal in the world of reality. It should also realize that this reason never exists alone. God is working all things together for good for those who love Him. If we allow Him to, God will use His trial to bring about righteousness in your life and encouragement to His people. God can turn encouragement into blessing, but the effects are still there. Now you can handle the effects if you're back in fellowship, but the effects aren't going to change. Now God can suspend sometimes. He says in absolute terms. I mean, obviously things can happen that can suspend certain things and alleviate some of the suffering, whatever. But by and large, what we're talking about is how the Christian now can handle that suffering by confessing his sin, getting back in fellowship, and dealing with the issue he's now dealing with, the judgment he's dealing with, the suffering he's dealing with. Like for instance, he's in prison. He can now handle that, and God can use him now. Sometimes he suffers because of God's discipline of sin. Now, this is a very important aspect. This is, again, the issue of eternal security. Guys always jump into that. So what they always want to accuse people who believe in eternal security is antinomianism. And they bring the sinner's prayer up, and the quick believism that these guys, Brian Dengler's talk about all the time. And say, oh, you guys can just say, a quick prayer and just walk off and, never look back and say you're a Christian and whatever. No, God has set up things to make you recognize that you need to know you're a Christian. And one of those things is God's discipline. And He tells you that in Hebrews 12. That if you recognize you're a child of God by the fact that you get disciplined by God. So none of us ever say, when we say grace and the idea of grace, free grace, and the idea of eternal security, we never say a Christian can just walk away and be indifferent to God. The thing is, you can't tell from the outside in what's going on with the individual. That's the problem. See, the Lordship Salvation guys, they think they can tell by what's going on with his life and how he's living, and they think he's getting away with something. Well, you don't know what's going on the inside. You don't know the turmoil that God is bringing in his life, the inside. And that's the reality of it. That's why you can never judge anyone from the outside if they're saved or not. Once they make a proclamation of what they believe that Jesus Christ died for the sins on the cross, rose again from the dead, and they're trusting Him as their personal Savior. If they profess that, well, then you can't say, okay, there's some other reason, there's something else going on that we're not aware. But the point is that the person makes that profession. All we can do is trust what he says. He actually, he's actually done it. He's believed. Now, if he believes something else, then he could, not be saved. And of course, if he's living a life of decadence and wickedness, you can say, as a testimony shot, you can say, yeah, the guy's probably not saved, but you can't be sure he's not. Even the Lordship Salvationists have to put that little doubt in there. They could say, they have to put in there, they don't think he's saved. Because you can't be sure. You never can be sure. And I know a lot of people get up there and they say, well, this guy's difficult, how this guy's going to... Not if he... Now, the gospel he's preaching is false. And people believe in that gospel. And they're depending on that gospel, like Brian Dengler's gospel, in the Lordship Salvation. That will send you to hell. That's not a true gospel. A false gospel. That's a false gospel. But if you believe the true gospel, you could have gone apostate and have now deceived and are preaching a false gospel. In Galatians, those Jews, they said they believed, they were saved Jews. But they were bringing a false gospel. Nothing is said about those people in the Galatians. Those people were not saved who were bringing this gospel to the Galatians. They were bringing the law in. But the fact of the matter is, they didn't say they weren't saved. But the people who now, their walk in the Galatians who were already saved, if they started following that false gospel, would have been corrupted in their walk. They would follow the law. And, of course, if you believe in the gospel that combines faith and works, that's a false gospel. That's anathema. And, that's why Paul said these guys need to be cut off. He says, have you ever noticed that when someone gushes, oh, I just love children, they really don't mean that. What they mean is they love well-behaved children. I've never met anyone who enjoys a society of undisciplined, spoiled children. You know the type of children I mean. I'm speaking of those children whose sinful nature has not been restrained, and as a result are textbook examples of self-centeredness, arrogance, and disobedience. That's a sin nature. People say, where do they come from? Your child won't start growing up. That sin nature gets exposed very quickly. It's about themselves, selfishness. And a parent has to put in discipline to control that sin nature. That child has to learn to be part of a family and to adjust to society and to recognize that there are limits to what he can do. And that's not being done anymore. I think we can all agree that children need discipline. I understand that nearly everyone reading these words is no longer a child. The days of parental discipline are long since past. Nevertheless, as much as we hate to admit it, we all need to be disciplined from time to time by our Heavenly Father. Please understand, I'm not talking about being punished for sin. All that punishment was poured out on the cross. Jesus took it all. See, you're not punished for sin. You're punished for being out of fellowship. Instead of speaking of discipline that is within the family, the kind of discipline that brings about holiness. So the fact of the matter is that sin has been dealt with. It's over. It's a fellowship issue now. To get you back in fellowship. That's why people say you don't have to use 1 John 1:9 because the sin has been paid for. Don't understand the issue of 1 John 1:9. It's the walk. You have to confess your walk. How can two walk together unless they're in agreement? Amos 3:3. You had a fellowship. And that's what you've sinned. The sin's been paid for, past. The penalty of sin has been paid for. But the fact of the matter is if you sin, you're out of fellowship with God. And now God has to deal with you to get you back into fellowship. Such discipline shouldn't be considered unusual or only for the especially sinful. Even well-behaved children still need the discipline of their parents. If they don't receive it, they won't stay well-behaved for long. So is with the Hebrews 12:8 states that everyone undergoes discipline. In fact, if we are never disciplined by the Lord, the text tells us that we are illegitimate children and not true sons and daughters at all. So that's the point where the Christian says, if you're going through a lot of suffering, if you're not going through enough suffering, no point. You say, well, and you're sinning, and you're just bearing the normal consequences of sin, to the world, but you're not getting additional suffering. That's unbearable. This type of suffering, the Father puts it onto you, is almost unbearable in the sense that you don't have any ability to deal with it in the flesh. Then they can say, you're not saved. That's how you're supposed to test. You're supposed to test it yourself and see, well, can I deal with this? It might mean discipline from God. And are these sins coming on me? Are the punishment for these sins being our fellowship? And are there things that clearly that God is involved in here in the suffering because I'm out of fellowship? This certainly makes sense when you think about it. As a rule, we don't discipline other people's children, although there are exceptions. We only discipline our own children. Parental discipline is an indication that we are in the family. In fact, it is a sign of the love of God. He disciplines us. Jesus said in Revelation 3:19, "Those whom I love, I rebuke and discipline." Put another way, the motivation for our discipline is not anger. It is not spite. It is not lingering malice involved. No, it is those who are loved by God who are rebuked and disciplined, so you can get back in fellowship and bear fruit. I admit this might sound odd at first blush, but when you take a moment and consider the implications, it makes perfect sense. When you're a child, you're envious of the kid on the block who's ignored by his parents. The kid can do anything he wants. He comes and goes as he pleases, and wherever he wants, wherever he pleases. He never has to be home at a certain time. If you skip school, no one seems to care. To the immature, this seems like an enviable situation, but is it really? It is that child who is loved that has a curfew. It is a child who is loved that has boundaries. It is a child who is loved that has rules enforced. Put another way, it is a child who is disciplined that is the child who is loved. The text of Hebrews argues that because we didn't hate our earthly fathers for disciplining us as children, we shouldn't turn bitter against our heavenly Father when He does the same thing. Even though the spanking we receive are painful for a moment, they produce a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained and corrected by them. Knowing this to be true, the author of Hebrews, He always give you enough discipline. You can handle it and respond to it, but it's additional to the cause and effect. So it comes right up to the point. God, just like the heavenly, your earthly fathers, the idea of discipline is not to break the child, but get to point the child to correct his actions. So God's discipline isn't to break you; it's to correct you. And we are not to become permanently disabled spiritually by this discipline, but rather strengthened and healed by it. Hebrews 12:13. Sometimes we suffer so that Christian character may be produced in us. And he quotes James 1:2-4. In this passage, we read about how testing of our faith ultimately brings about Christian maturity. Suffering, it seems like, unlike anything else, develops in the believer perseverance and what we might call stick-to-itiveness. It teaches us not to give up, but rather to rely on God in the moment-to-moment dependence. That's the whole purpose. Yeah, it's when you're suffering, time stops basically, and it's all involved now in dealing with that particular issue of that problem. And every other thing's trivial in your life. It really gets you focused. There are two biblical illustrations of what this process of producing Christian character is like. The first that is refining fire. The second is that of a plant. And he quotes 1 Peter 6-7. The picture here is of gold being placed under intense heat. As the gold melts and turns to liquid, all the imperfections either float to the surface or they may be skimmed off or burnt away by the fire. What is left is the purest of gold without the defects and flaws it previously had. And of course, we go through the judgment seat of Christ. We're going to go as though for fire. And all wood, hay, and stubble gets burned up. And what's on the left is pure, that we did in the Spirit. The second illustration come the words of Jesus in John 15:1-5. Those of us who ever had gardens understand the truth of this teaching. Yet no gardener ever allows the plant to grow without tending it. There is a pruning process in which those growths that take away from the fruitfulness of the plant are removed. This process is never haphazard, nor is there any cruelty on behalf of the gardener. In fact, every good gardener cherishes the plants and desires their growth. Good gardeners take delight in going to the garden and assessing the growth of the stalk, engaging the size of the fruit, or even bragging to their friends about the fruitfulness of the plant. This reflects, at least in some way, the delight of the Father as He watches us mature, as He sees the fruit, as He gently guides us to ever more fruitfulness. Those acts of pruning must come, but they are never instances of vindictiveness or carelessness. No, they are acts of love for our own good. So sometimes God will have to take things away in order to get us to grow. Some things we think that are important, to get us refocused, get our minds right, get our vision, get us remotivated. We're drifting. And so my wife loves watching these shows in the morning. From England, they have these shows about plants and growing harvesting flowers, and this guy has all these in England. It's like all these gardens and everything else. And all you see is weeding and pruning and all these type of things. A husbandman is tending plants. There's a love and affection there, which includes a great deal of removing weeds and cutting into the plant. And if it gets too, they got to cut around it. And this plant is growing. You got to move this, move that. So a lot of work. And the idea is that the purpose of it isn't to kill the plant. The purpose is to get that plant to bear a better fruit. And so the Christian life, we often start drifting. It's very easy to drift in a Christian life, especially like in a country like America, where there's so many distractions. And God gets refocused. Start pruning. And that's to get you refocused on what's important in life. And that's the issue. The pruning is for a purpose, to say, okay, you're looking at this as enjoyment. You're looking at this as enjoyment. You're looking at this as, this is pleasurable. This is, and you say, I'm just going to take that away. You need that, And he'll get your attention. He'll get your attention. And as I said, I gave that example in another video, where it says, where they had the whole series on SEAL training, buds training, and the guys go in there and they're supposed to go under the water, and they have their wetsuits on, and the water's freezing cold. And a lot of them are on top of the water, they're swimming on top of it, which makes you a target. So they come back, and the SEALs trainers have these guys take off their wetsuits and go right back in the water. And now you're going to go under the water. You'll learn. And the guy says, we have ways of teaching. They didn't do it the right way the first time, when they had wetsuits on, which was easier. Now they're going to do it without the wetsuits. They got to go under the water, under freezing water. They're always ways of getting their attention, he says. And God says, as a way of getting you refocused. And that's what pruning is. Sometimes we suffer that we might comfort others. Praise be to God, and he quotes here 2 Corinthians 1:3-6. And this is the issue that we've experienced, we now can relate to other people having never experienced anything. So other people are going to go through the same things, and people we've gone undergo, we can now relate to them and understand their suffering and comfort them, because we've gone through that same type of suffering. As believers, we don't merely experience our own suffering, we also enter the sufferings of others in the body of Christ. We rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. As I look back at my years in the past to it, I cannot count the number of times when I've moved to tears as I spoke to another member of the body. And I know this experience is not unique to me. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? When we see another believer in distress, it's only natural that we want to comfort them. It doesn't matter to us why that one is suffering. A true believer desires to comfort another in the body. This being said, although we share the same Spirit, the Holy Spirit, and possess the same Bible, the best comfort comes from the ones who suffer in the same way as the ones suffering. I don't know how you're suffering. That's like, that's like the infantry. Only another infantryman can really understand what a combat infantryman has gone through combat. No one else can understand that experience. The pressure, the stress, the whole issue that those guys go through, and they understand that another combat infantryman who's gone through combat can relate to another individual who's gone through combat, and they can, and you'll see that these guys, they don't talk when they get back from a war zone to other people, civilians and other people in the military who've never seen combat, but they'll open up to fellow combat veterans, because they know that guy knows what he's been through. I don't know how you're suffering today, but I know that this trial, which is certainly unique in its details to you alone, is nevertheless common to all mankind. You aren't the first to suffer in this way, and you certainly won't be the last. But because God cares for his people so much, he often allows us to suffer some special trial in order that further down the road we may be a comfort to others who are hurting as we are. So there's a benefit you can pass on to other people, other Christians that you've gone through. At this point, I should be quick to add that this isn't a one-on-one proposition. We don't suffer to help just one other individual. No, the comfort that we receive, and we do receive comfort from the Savior, don't we? Will later bless the hearts of many other believers as we share in their burdens and comfort them with the same comfort we've received. Then he has here, sometimes we must suffer because of conflict in the spiritual realms. And he's talking about the issue of Job. Now, this is really an issue of what's going behind the scenes. And the issue of, there's always the issue of the angelic war going on, and the issue of Job pointing out is, Satan brought up the issue of he couldn't get to Job. And God said, okay, I'll open certain, allow you to go after him, but of course he said, you can't take his life. And of course, one of the three friends thing. All three friends, his three friends, thought he was suffering for sin. And it wasn't for sin. Now it comes later on that there was an aspect of, sin that had to be removed in a sense of self-righteousness. That, the level of growth that Job had reached was so high that there was a point where he was forgetting what the growth was about. But he's mentioned that in Ezekiel 14:14, where it says, three men, on their own righteousness could only have saved them, and from a physical salvation, they couldn't pass on that salvation to their children. Ezekiel 14:14, which is Daniel, Job, and Noah. So that's how high a standing Daniel, much beloved by God, So that's the issue of how much Job and of course Noah found grace in the sight of God, and God turned over the position of Adam that Adam had originally, and turned that position over to Noah, rule of the world in the sense of humanity, because God of this world is really Satan after the fall. But he'll say there are several important lessons for us to learn from this text. First, notice that the reason for Job's suffering was none of the reasons we've mentioned so far. Instead, Job was put on display to teach the angelic realm about the faith of a believer. Second, we should observe that Job's suffering was always under control. Satan complains that God put a hedge around Job and everything that he has. He says, in essence, I can't touch him until you allow me to. When he takes up Satan's challenge, God says that everything Job has is Satan's, but that Satan is not permitted to touch Job himself. There was a limit to how much suffering God would allow in Job's life. Satan comes back in chapter 2 when God once again brags on Job. After repeating his initial assessment of Job, God says yet he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. Job 2:3. Again, notice that there was no physical reason for Job's suffering. There was nothing you could point to in Job's life to account for the trial that he was going through, which his friends accused him. Well, God wouldn't be doing this unless you did so. You were a sinner. Satan isn't finished. He counsels that a man will give everything he owns for his life. But if you let me touch him, I haven't been able to do that yet. You stopped me, but let me touch him, and that's all it will take. So God moves his protection back one more step. He allows Satan to touch Job physically, but refuses to allow Satan to take his life. As a result, Job is afflicted physically in every way imaginable. Physical suffering, on top of the emotional suffering of losing his children, and his wife leaves him, and lost all his wealth. What is important to notice is that Job, when it's all finished, never finds out why these things happen. As we read through the book, we know that Job never did. Still, it's important to see that there was a reason. It's important that didn't cut short God's love for a servant. It was a reason that was resulting in Job being honored from that time till now. It's justified, like Abraham was. Justified. Oh, no one's always suffering. Yeah, well, that's justification. Job was justified before men. Glorified God, vindicated, and of course, the angelic realm. What was true for Job may be true for you. Perhaps God has said, "Have you considered my servant? that there's none like him or her on the earth, that he or she is blameless and upright, someone who fears God and shuns evil. It could be that you are teaching the angelic realm something that would they would never learn. Remember, the angels want to look into these things. And so there's a great issue going on with the Christian that angels are looking into, watching. The issue of faith. Faith amazes them. That we can walk by faith, and before we persuade of things that we don't see. We just believe words in a book. we believe what the book Word of God tells us, and that frankly amazes them. It could be that you are teaching the angelic realm something that they would never learn otherwise. And like Job, it may be that you would never find out for the reason for your suffering. Benefit of the study, knowing that there's a reason for suffering helps us ward off the nagging suspicion that somehow God is unjust or that he's capricious and unfeeling with no sympathy for the suffering of his people. Nothing could be further from the truth. God has some good purpose for the suffering you're experiencing now. So, there's always a reason for suffering for the Christian. Suffering is a reality, and the Christian needs to find out, think about, meditate on the issue of why whatever suffering he's going through is happening. And there are various reasons for suffering. And this is why you can't judge from the outside. Job is a perfect example. These three guys get up there and they're three friends, and Job is saying, "Why do you keep accusing me of sin? I'm not sinning." They said, "Certainly God wouldn't be doing this to you, if you weren't a sinner." That's lordship salvation. That's lordship, God must be doing this, clearly you've sinned, you've done this, you've done that. They thought they can only see what Job was, the obvious. They couldn't see behind the scenes what was going on. Job was not a sinner. Now, well, sinners in the sense that, none of us are sinless, but the fact was that the things they were accusing him, he was living a righteous life, as far as it was as we could say, in the sense of doing what God wanted him to do. But of course, there's always internal issues, and that we have to deal with. He gets self-righteous, which was a problem with Job. He says, he was defending his own righteousness, and that's an issue you have to recognize. You always, everything is by the grace of God. But I want to stop here. The issue of suffering is a crucial element. Christians do suffer. Christians will suffer. And suffering is something that a Christian has to deal with as part of living in the real world. And there are reasons for it, and the Christian has to figure out what's going on. But they always go back to the attributes of God. God can't be unfair. And whatever's happening, God hasn't left you. God is still there. And the issue is, first thing you have to find out, how are you suffering because you're out of fellowship? Are you suffering because you're out of fellowship? How's your walk with God? Have you drifted away from God? If you have, then you've got to get back right with God. That's using 1 John 1:9, and getting back filled with the Spirit and starting walking with God, renewing your walk with Him. It's very easy to start drifting off. If that's not the case, and you say, "No, I'm not sinning, and I've been right with God, and this is happening, that's happening," well then, if you're able to handle it and handle it, and it's like a testing. God is trying to get you to understand some things, and to get you grown up out of your priorities, get your priorities strengthened. To focus on eternity, focus on the eternal, the judgment seat of Christ. Focus on the reality of heaven. We're not supposed to get complacent in time, on earth. This is not a home. So God will often bring in discomfort. Say, "Well, this is not your home. Don't get comfortable here." The infantry in World War II, they stay someplace for a while. And like we not normally do. You fix it up, so this is not nice, and then before you know it, you're moving. The infantry, always moving. So don't get too comfortable here. As for God's son, don't get comfortable here. This is not your home. That's why these guys think the millennium, they're going to replace Israel. It's not our home. Earth's not our home. Heaven is our home. And God will get you focused on heaven by bringing some suffering in your life here on earth and say, don't worry about this stuff here. That flesh, that body of your flesh, it's going to be gone. It's going to be gone. You're going to get a resurrected body that can't sin. And you're going to be in a glorified state, and you're going to be in heaven with God forever, with the Lord as the bride of Christ. If you suffer with Him, you rule with Him on earth on the millennium kingdom. But God has to get refocused, because often the Christian often loses focus in his walk, get distracted, and that's where the pruning comes in. He says, "Oh, wait, this is getting you off track here." And so, various reasons for suffering, and the Christian has responsibility to understand these reasons, go in and understand the issue of sin, his sin nature, and take an account of where he is in his relationship with God, and says, well, what's going on here? Suffering has a way of getting your attention. And that's the purpose of it. It has a way of saying, okay, what's going on? What am I doing? And what's the purpose of this? And it could be a purpose to get you right with God. It could be a purpose of getting you already right with God and get you growth. It could be for reasons of experience to comfort others, so you can experience something and so you could be a blessing to other people. So let me stop here and put this up. Amen. Thank you.